my father didn't show any ill effects of smoking until partway through his life. I suppose he would have been probably around early 50s when he got a dose of bronchitis one Easter. Now, he'd never been ill in his life ever at all of any sort, always been a very, very fit man, very healthy man. And ultimately my father had more and more episodes of chest infections, general ill health, and then sadly was diagnosed with emphysema, which is one of the chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, which I think people are now familiar with. He found that he couldn't go out when it was windy and when the weather was cold and when the weather was wet and so on, because it affected his breathing and he was finding difficulties. By this stage he was on to a variety of pills and potions. He had different types of inhalers, and ultimately his emphysema reached the point where actually he wasn't able to smoke anymore. Literally wasn't able to. He had insufficient lung capacity to manage to inhale on a cigarette, and that was the only time when he finally stopped smoking. It got to that point before he actually gave up, and ultimately he just did less and less, and eventually finished up for the last few years of his life, sadly, moving between bed and an armchair in the bungalow in which my parents were living at the time, with an oxygen cylinder next to him in the chair and 2 tubes sticking up his nostrils, and he needed that to breathe. So he had a really miserable, I would say probably the last 5 or 6 years of his life were extremely uncomfortable and unpleasant for him. And I remember one Christmas, leading up to Christmas, I asked him what he would like for Christmas present that year, and he actually said a new pair of lungs. I found that very difficult really to deal with, because there was a bit of me wanted to say, well, I did try and tell you this many, many times over the years. On the other hand, obviously, as his son, having to recognise that he was suffering badly and it was seriously, affecting his quality of life. Sadly, it affected my mother's quality of life as well, because when she retired, I think they'd been hoping that the pair of them could travel. My father always wanted to go back to South Africa, where he'd been for part of the war, but he just wasn't able to do those sorts of things. He was really confined to the bungalow, trips to the GP surgery, and very occasionally, if the weather was right, he could perhaps get out in the car for a short drive. But he was really very severely disabled by it over, as I say, probably the last 5 or 6 years of his life. It was really sad to see a man who was so proud and had been so fit and so strong reach the end in that way. COPD is one of those diseases that creeps up on you slowly, or it does on most people anyway. And if you recognise the symptoms early enough, or go and seek help so you can get the symptoms diagnosed early enough, then there is a lot that you can do to improve your chances, improve the length of your life, and particularly improve the quality of your life and the life of those around you.